The fourth and final lecture on global aging will focus on the socio-economic implications of aging across the world. At the end of this lecture, you'll be able to define certain ratios used in economics and sociology, including the dependency ratio, the potential support ratio, the economic support ratio, and the labor force participation rate. You'll also be able to discuss the economic and social impacts of aging, as well as the differences between developed and developing regions, and implications for the future. So, these ratios are often used by economists and sociologists when describing populations and the impact of aging on a population. So let's start with the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio really talks about the percentage of the population that we consider within the productive, working, economically active age group compared to those on either end of the spectrum who are likely to be not working. So it's a ratio of people aged less than 20 and more than or equal to 65 years old compared to the number 20 to 64 per 100 population. The potential support ratio is the population aged 20 to 60 compared to the population aged more than or equal to 65. So a high potential support ratio means we have a large number of young working people compared to retired people, whereas a low potential support ratio means we have a small amount of young working age people compared to older retired people. The economic support ratio compares equivalent producers to equivalent consumers. So are you somebody who is making money, or are you somebody who is spending money? And finally, the labor force participation rate compares the economically active population, employed, self-employed, and so on, compared to the total population, and this is by age group. We will be discussing these in context later in this presentation. Let's look at older people and the economy and compare different regions of the world. So the first thing we want to look at is poverty rates within the older population. What this graph looks at is on the vertical axis we have the percentage of people 60 and over who are in poverty, and on the horizontal axis we have the percentage of the total population in poverty. So the bottom right hand corner of the graph represents that older people are less poor than the general population, whereas the top left hand corner of the graph represents that older people are poorer than the general population. And you can see there's a stark difference between different economic regions. So the poorest countries in Africa tend to have a lot more older people in poverty compared to the general population, whereas if we go down to Eastern and Southern Europe, then the poverty rate is lower in the older population compared to the younger population. And if we look at the OECD countries, the more affluent countries such as Great Britain, Denmark, Italy, Greece, Portugal, the Netherlands, all have older populations, older people who are less likely to be poor or have less poverty than the general population. But it's not a hard and fast rule. Look at places like Switzerland, Mexico, USA, where the proportion of older people in poverty is greater than the general population. And so it's not just about economics, it's also about societal norms and societal support. So now let's look at labor force participation. This is in males and females. And what you can clearly see is two things. Firstly, in people age 65 and over are much more likely to remain part of the workforce if they are in a developing country than if they are in a developed country. The darker color means a higher percentage of people 65 and over are still in the active workforce. And men are much more likely to be working than women. And this really has two big implications. The first is the reason that older people are part of the workforce after 65 in the developing world is because they have no choice. They don't get state pensions to the level of the developed world. They don't get state or other support to the level of the developed world. And therefore the only way for them to survive is to work and make money. However, the other side of that is that even though that is true, it's much less likely that women will be part of the workforce, which really begs the question, what happens to an older woman in the developing world? And these people are much more likely to be at risk of severe poverty and the consequences of that. This describes pretty much the same thing as before, but now we're looking at consumption. And the bottom line is this. So in high-income countries, when you get older, you are much more likely to become a net consumer. And that's because you're able to retire, you're no longer part of the active workforce, and you have enough money that you can spend. Whereas in the lower and upper middle income countries, the older people are much more likely to remain net producers of income rather than consumers, which we described in the previous slide is due to necessity. So we talked about the potential support ratio. And remember, this has a really big implication. You need to have enough people of working age to support the people who have retired. But look at what's happening here. In the developing world, we still have a very high potential support ratio, a large proportion of young adults in working age compared to older retired people. But as we get more wealthy and our population ages, that potential support ratio drops dramatically, so that in North America it's 4, in Europe it's only 3.5, and on top of that, you can see that the prediction is as time passes, the potential support ratio will drop in all countries. That has significant economic implications unless countries are prepared and willing to modify their workforce practices. For example, increasing the age of retirement. Finally, let's look at some of the social implications of aging. If we look at different age groups and their ability to perform the activities of daily living, dressing, walking across a room, bathing, eating, and so on, we can see that this is significantly impaired, or a significantly increasing proportion of patients report difficulty in doing these activities with increasing age. So it looks as if older people tend to be more dependent and less able to function independently as they get older. And this goes back to the concept of the oldest old and extreme aging and its impact on the socio-economic fabric of the community and on the healthcare system. Look at this one. What about psychological impact of these things? So this is not about aging, this is really about patients with long-standing illness. And what we're seeing here is that older people with long-standing illness with limitations are much more likely to feel lonely than younger people. And that loneliness and depression has a significant impact not only on their mental health but on their physical health and their social and economic well-being as well. So this brings us to the end of this 4-part series. Again, if you have any questions or comments, you can post it on our WhatsApp group, or you can post it on the TEMA website chat, and we'll try to answer them. In summary, population aging has significant social and economic implications, but also can provide opportunities. However, we need to recognize the phenomenon and plan for it. I hope that you found this little series of talks useful and informative. Thank you.